November 14th, 1953, 11:34 p.m. The 145th Street subway station on the ABCD line, one of the busiest transit hubs in Harlem during daytime hours, but largely deserted this late on a Thursday night, when most working people had already made their way home, and when the only passengers remaining were night shift workers, insomniacs, and people whose business kept them out after hours for reasons they preferred not to discuss with authorities. The platform was approximately 350 feet long, 15 feet wide, bordered on one side by tiled walls, and on the other by the lethal third rail that carried 625 volts of direct current electricity, capable of killing a person instantly if contacted. Bumpy Johnson descended the stairs to the northbound platform at 11:34 p.m., returning from a meeting in Midtown Manhattan with a banker who laundered money through accounts that appeared legitimate, but that channeled hundreds of thousands of dollars from Harlem's numbers racket into investments that generated returns without attracting IRS attention. The meeting had run later than Bumpy had anticipated, had lasted until 11:17 p.m., which meant taking the subway home rather than his usual car service, because Marcus Webb and his security detail had been deployed to handle a different matter that required immediate attention. Taking the subway alone at night wasn't Bumpy's preferred security protocol, but at 63 years old and after 4 decades of criminal operations, he'd developed the kind of situational awareness that usually provided sufficient warning of threats before they became immediate dangers. But tonight's situation was different. Tonight's threat had been planned by people who understood Bumpy's patterns, who'd tracked his movements, who'd identified the subway as the one environment where his usual security advantages would be neutralized by confined space, limited escape routes, and the inability to summon immediate backup. Tonight's threat came from 5 professional assassins who'd been hired by the Colombo crime family specifically to eliminate Bumpy Johnson in a way that would appear accidental rather than orchestrated murder. A death that could be attributed to a subway accident, a tragic fall onto the tracks, a drunk stumbling or a heart attack causing collapse at the wrong moment. The 5 assassins were positioned throughout the 145th Street station before Bumpy arrived. They'd been waiting for 47 minutes, having received intelligence that Bumpy's meeting would end around 11:00 p.m., and that he'd likely take the subway home rather than his usual car. The positioning was strategic, designed to create a situation where Bumpy would be funneled toward the platform edge with no avenue for retreat or lateral escape. The plan required coordination, timing, and willingness to commit violence in a public space where security cameras were present, but where the late hour meant minimal witnesses who might interfere. The 5 assassins were led by Robert "Bobby Rails" Delacroix, a 41-year-old contract killer who'd worked for various New York crime families since 1948, and who specialized in making murders appear accidental. Delacroix had killed 17 people over his 5-year career, each death staged to look like accident, suicide, or natural causes, and he'd never been arrested or seriously investigated, because the staging was always convincing enough that police accepted surface explanations without deeper inquiry. His 4 associates for tonight's operation were Anthony "Tony Trax" Morelli, 38, 6 contract kills; James "Jimmy Platform" Sullivan, 35, 4 kills; David "Davy Signal" Romano, 33, 3 kills; and Nicholas "Nicky Third Rail" Costa, 31, 2 kills. Combined experience: 32 contract killings, 0 arrests, 0 failed operations. Bumpy reached the northbound platform at 11:36 p.m. and immediately recognized that something was wrong. The platform should have contained at least a few other passengers. Even at this late hour, there were always some people waiting for trains. But tonight, the platform appeared completely empty except for 5 men who were positioned in a formation that was too deliberate to be coincidental. 2 men near the stairs where Bumpy had entered. 2 men approximately halfway down the platform. 1 man at the far end near the tunnel entrance where trains emerged. The positioning created a box, a containment formation, a setup that Bumpy had seen before in different contexts, and that always meant the same thing. Someone had decided he needed to die and had invested resources in making it happen professionally. The tactical assessment took Bumpy approximately 3 seconds. He was on a subway platform with 5 men who were almost certainly assassins. The platform had 2 exits: the stairs he'd just descended, which were blocked by 2 of the 5 men, and stairs at the far end, which were 350 feet away, and would require running past the other 3 assassins to reach. The platform edge was to his left, approximately 8 feet away, bordered by tracks that carried trains, but that also contained the third rail, whose 625 volts would kill instantly if touched. Behind him was a tiled wall that offered no cover and no escape route. The next northbound train, according to the digital display board, would arrive in approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes was an eternity in tactical terms, was more than enough time for 5 professional killers to close distance and execute whatever plan they'd developed for making Bumpy's death appear accidental. But 4 minutes was also an opportunity if Bumpy could identify weaknesses in their positioning, could force errors through unexpected actions, could survive long enough that the arriving train would change the tactical calculus in ways that might create escape possibilities that didn't currently exist. Bobby Delacroix stepped forward at 11:37 p.m., closing the distance between himself and Bumpy to approximately 40 feet, near enough to communicate but far enough to maintain defensive positioning if Bumpy was armed or decided to attack rather than comply with whatever came next. Delacroix's voice was conversational, professional, explaining the situation with the kind of calm certainty that professionals use when they believe they've established complete control over circumstances. "Mr. Johnson, we've been hired to handle a problem. That problem is you. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Easy way is you have a heart attack. You fall onto the tracks, you get electrocuted by the third rail, and it looks like a tragic accident. Hard way is we throw you onto the tracks, you get electrocuted anyway, and it looks like we witnessed an old man having a medical emergency and falling despite our attempts to help. Either way, you're dying tonight on this platform. The only variable is how much it hurts before you die." The statement was designed to create psychological pressure, to present a false choice that would make victims believe they had some control over their fate, when in reality both options ended identically. Bumpy had heard similar speeches before from people who believed they'd created situations where outcomes were predetermined. Sometimes they'd been right. Other times they'd been catastrophically wrong about how much control they actually had. Tonight would determine which category these 5 assassins fell into. Bumpy's response was to move left, toward the platform edge, reducing the distance between himself and the tracks to approximately 4 feet. The movement was counterintuitive. Most people when cornered move away from danger rather than toward it. But Bumpy understood something about tactical psychology that the 5 assassins apparently didn't. People who are trying to make a death look accidental become more cautious when their target moves closer to the actual death mechanism, because accidental deaths require plausible scenarios, and a target who deliberately jumps onto tracks doesn't fit the narrative of heart attack or tragic stumble. The movement also changed the tactical geometry. Bumpy was now positioned with his back to the tracks, facing the 5 assassins, forcing them to approach from the front rather than from multiple angles. If they wanted to push him onto the tracks, they'd need to cross the 4 feet he'd deliberately left between himself and the platform edge. Would need to get close enough that Bumpy could defend or counterattack before being shoved backward. The positioning wasn't advantageous. Bumpy was still outnumbered 5-1, still trapped on a platform with limited escape routes. But it was less disadvantageous than being surrounded, and in tactical situations, the difference between bad positioning and slightly less bad positioning could determine survival versus death. The digital display updated at 11:38 p.m. Train arriving in 3 minutes. The 5 assassins began closing their formation, moving from their spread-out positions toward a tighter arrangement that would allow coordinated assault. Bobby Delacroix took the lead position, approximately 30 feet from Bumpy. Tony Morelli and Jimmy Sullivan moved to flanking positions, approximately 25 feet away, and angled to cut off any lateral movement Bumpy might attempt. Davey Romano and Nicky Costa maintained rear positions that blocked the stairwell exit, ensuring that if Bumpy tried to run backward, he'd be intercepted before reaching escape. The formation was professional, demonstrated experience with coordinated attacks, reflected the kind of tactical thinking that came from people who'd executed similar operations successfully. But the formation also contained an assumption that would prove catastrophic. The assumption that Bumpy Johnson, at 63 years old and outnumbered 5-1, would behave like a victim rather than like someone who'd spent 4 decades surviving situations where death seemed inevitable. At 11:39 p.m., 2 minutes before the train's scheduled arrival, Bobby Delacroix gave the order for final approach. Everyone moves at once. We surround him. We push him onto the tracks. We make it look like we tried to grab him but couldn't stop him from falling. Medical emergency, tragic accident. We cooperate fully with police investigation. Quick and clean. Go. The five assassins began their coordinated advance at 11:39:17 p.m. Bobby Delacroix from the front, Tony Morelli and Jimmy Sullivan from the flanks, Davey Romano and Nicky Costa from behind, closing the box, reducing the space until Bumpy would have nowhere to move except backward onto the tracks where 625 volts would stop his heart before he could even fall completely. The formation tightened. 40 feet became 30, became 20, became 15. The digital display showed 90 seconds until train arrival. The sound of the approaching train became audible in the tunnel, a distant rumble that would grow to a roar as thousands of tons of metal approached at 40 miles per hour. At 11:39:47 p.m., when the five assassins were approximately 12 feet from Bumpy and closing rapidly for final assault, something happened that none of them had anticipated, because none of them had truly understood who they were dealing with. Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a desperate attempt to diffuse tension, but a genuine expression of satisfaction that came from someone who just recognized that what appeared to be a hopeless situation was actually an opportunity that his opponents had created, without understanding what they were giving him. The approaching train became visible in the tunnel at 11:40:03 p.m., its headlights illuminating the curved track approximately 400 feet from the platform, traveling at standard approach speed of 42 miles per hour. The sound intensified from distant rumble to present roar, the noise filling the underground station with the kind of overwhelming audio that makes conversation impossible and that creates sensory overload that affects tactical decision-making. Most people on subway platforms instinctively move away from the platform edge when trains approach, responding to the combination of noise, wind, and proximity to several thousand tons of moving metal. Bumpy Johnson moved closer. The movement was 2 steps backward, reducing the distance between himself and the platform edge from 4 feet to approximately 18 inches. The five assassins were now 8 feet away and closing, their formation tight, their coordination obvious. Bobby Delacroix was directly ahead. Tony Morelli had moved to Bumpy's left, Jimmy Sullivan to his right. Davey Romano and Nicky Costa were slightly behind the first three, forming a second wave that would prevent any lateral escape attempt. The box was complete. The trap was set. The train was 43 seconds from the platform. What the five assassins didn't understand, what they couldn't have understood without decades of experience reading human behavior under extreme pressure, was that Bumpy's smile at 11:39:47 p.m. hadn't been desperation or acceptance of inevitable death. It had been recognition. Bumpy had suddenly understood exactly how the situation would resolve, had seen in the tactical geometry and the timing of the approaching train a solution that would seem impossible until it happened, and would seem obvious in retrospect once it was complete. The key variable was psychological rather than physical. The five assassins were coordinating their assault to push Bumpy onto the tracks, were timing their final rush to happen before the train arrived, so that Bumpy's death would appear to be fall, followed by electrocution rather than being hit by train. Being hit by a train created too many variables. Witnesses on the train operators who might testify about what they'd seen, physical evidence that would be harder to stage as accident. The plan required Bumpy to be on the tracks before the train arrived, required him to contact the third rail and die from electrocution, required the train to then hit an already dead body in a way that would be consistent with someone who'd fallen accidentally. But this timing requirement created a window, a brief period where the assassins would be committed to their assault, but would also be aware of the approaching train, would be experiencing the psychological pressure of needing to complete their attack, and then retreat to safety before several thousand tons of metal reached the platform. That window was 57 seconds long, beginning at 11:40:03 p.m., when the train became visible, and ending at 11:41 p.m., when the train would reach the platform. During those 57 seconds, the five assassins would be managing two competing priorities: kill Bumpy and avoid being killed themselves by the approaching train. Bumpy had one priority: survive the 57 seconds. At 11:40 p.m., 32 seconds remaining until train arrival, Bobby Delacroix made his final approach. He closed the distance from 8 feet to 4 feet in 2 quick steps, reaching out to grab Bumpy's jacket for the push that would send him backward onto the tracks. The movement was aggressive, committed, designed to use momentum and surprise to overwhelm any resistance Bumpy might offer. What Delacroix didn't anticipate was that Bumpy wouldn't resist at all. Bumpy stepped backward at 11:40:12 p.m., moving with Delacroix's push rather than against it. adding his own momentum to the shove that was supposed to send him onto the tracks. But instead of stepping straight backward onto the tracks, Bumpy stepped at an angle, backward and to the right, a movement that took him parallel to the platform edge rather than perpendicular to it. The angle was precisely calculated, was the result of decades of experience with spatial awareness and body positioning, was designed to accomplish something that Delacroix wouldn't understand until it was too late, transferring Delacroix's forward momentum into a direction that Delacroix hadn't intended. Delacroix's push, combined with Bumpy's angled movement, caused Delacroix to overextend, to lean forward past his center of balance, to move toward the platform edge with momentum that couldn't be stopped quickly. Bumpy's right hand shot out at 11:13 p.m., grabbing Delacroix's jacket at the shoulder, not pulling but redirecting, using Delacroix's own momentum against him, guiding him toward the 18-inch gap between the platform edge and certain death. Delacroix realized what was happening and tried to correct his balance, but momentum and physics don't negotiate. He went over the edge at 11:14 p.m., falling approximately 4 feet onto the tracks, his body landing between the rails, but his right leg extending outward to contact the third rail at 11:15 p.m. The 625 volts of direct current electricity stopped Bobby Delacroix's heart instantly. His body convulsed once, the involuntary muscle contraction that happens when electrical current overrides normal nervous system function, and then collapsed completely onto the tracks. The train was 23 seconds away, traveling at 42 miles per hour, with stopping distance of approximately 300 feet even if the operator saw the body immediately and applied emergency brakes. Delacroix was already dead. The train would ensure he couldn't be revived. The 4 remaining assassins processed what had just happened in the 2 seconds after Delacroix went over the edge. Their leader was dead. Their coordinated assault had been turned against them through a single movement that had transformed attacker into victim. And the train was 21 seconds away, close enough now that the wind from its approach was causing papers and debris on the platform to swirl. Close enough that the roar was overwhelming. Close enough that everyone on the platform could feel the vibration through the floor. Tony Morelli and Jimmy Sullivan, who'd been positioned on Bumpy's flanks, made simultaneous decisions to abort the assault and retreat to safety. This was rational calculation. Their operation had failed, their leader was dead, and staying on the platform meant risking being hit by the approaching train. They began backing away from Bumpy at 11:17 p.m., creating distance that would allow them to retreat to the stairs and exit before the situation deteriorated further. But Bumpy Johnson didn't allow retreat. At 11:18 p.m., he moved toward Tony Morelli with speed that seemed impossible for a 63-year-old man who should have been exhausted and terrified by nearly being pushed onto subway tracks. Bumpy covered the 6 feet between himself and Morelli in less than 1 second, his right hand grabbing Morelli's jacket, his left hand pushing against Morelli's chest, using the same technique that had sent Delacroix over the edge. Morelli tried to resist, tried to plant his feet and maintain balance. But Bumpy had momentum and positioning and the element of complete surprise that came from victims suddenly becoming aggressor. Morelli went over the platform edge at 11:19 p.m., falling onto the tracks approximately 15 feet from where Delacroix's body lay. Morelli was more fortunate than Delacroix in that he didn't immediately contact the third rail, landed between the rails in a way that avoided electrocution. But the train was 17 seconds away, and Morelli's survival depended on his ability to climb back onto the platform or press himself flat between the rails before several thousand tons of metal reached his position. He attempted to climb at 11:21 p.m., grabbing the platform edge and pulling himself upward. Bumpy stepped on Morelli's hands at 11:22 p.m., applying enough pressure that Morelli's grip loosened, sending him falling back onto the tracks. The train was 15 seconds away. Morelli tried again at 11:24 p.m., desperation overriding pain, managing to get his upper body onto the platform edge. Bumpy kicked him in the face at 11:25 p.m., a deliberate strike that broke Morelli's nose and sent him falling backward onto the tracks for the third and final time. The train was 12 seconds away. Morelli wouldn't have time for another climbing attempt. Jimmy Sullivan watched Tony Morelli's repeated failures to escape the tracks and made different calculation. Instead of retreating, Sullivan attacked, drawing a knife from inside his jacket and moving toward Bumpy with the blade extended in a thrust designed to incapacitate or kill. The attack came at 11:27 p.m., when the train was 10 seconds away, when the platform was vibrating from the approaching mass. when rational decisions had been overwhelmed by the kind of desperate aggression that happens when people realize they're in situations beyond their control. Bumpy sidestepped Sullivan's knife thrust at 11:28 p.m., a movement that took him 6 inches to the left while Sullivan's momentum carried him forward past Bumpy's previous position. Bumpy's hand closed on Sullivan's wrist at 11:29 p.m., controlling the knife, redirecting Sullivan's forward momentum toward the platform edge. Sullivan understood what was about to happen and tried to reverse direction, but momentum doesn't reverse on command. He went over the edge at 11:30 p.m., joining Delacroix and Morelli on the tracks. The train was 7 seconds away. Sullivan's body would be hit by the train's leading edge doing 42 miles per hour, which would result in immediate death and severe trauma that would make identification difficult. Davy Romano and Nicky Costa, the final 2 assassins, were positioned approximately 20 feet from Bumpy at 11:31 p.m. They'd watched their 3 colleagues die or be sent onto the tracks in a span of 17 seconds. They could hear the train approaching, could see its headlights illuminating the tunnel, could feel the wind and vibration that indicated several thousand tons of metal was about to reach the platform. The rational decision was obvious: abandon the assassination attempt, retreat to the stairs, exit the station before police arrived to investigate the bodies on the tracks. But Bumpy Johnson moved toward them at 11:32 p.m., rather than allowing their retreat. The movement was aggressive, deliberate, designed to prevent the 2 remaining assassins from reporting back to whoever had hired them about what had happened on the 145th Street platform. Bumpy covered the 20 feet between himself and Romano Costa in approximately 3 seconds, reaching them at 11:35 p.m. when the train was 4 seconds from the platform. The final confrontation lasted 3 seconds. Romano threw a punch at 11:36 p.m. that Bumpy deflected. Costa attempted to grab Bumpy in a wrestling hold at 11:37 p.m. Bumpy used Costa's momentum against him, redirecting the grab into a position where Costa lost his balance. Romano tried to help Costa at 11:38 p.m., creating a situation where both men were off balance and vulnerable. Bumpy pushed both men toward the platform edge at 11:39 p.m., using their own entangled positioning against them, sending both over the edge at 11:40 p.m. The train reached the platform at 11:41 p.m., exactly on schedule, traveling at standard approach speed. The train operator saw bodies on the tracks and applied emergency brakes at 11:41:02 p.m., but the stopping distance from 42 miles per hour is approximately 300 feet, and the bodies were scattered across 100 feet of track. The train hit Bobby Delacroix's body at 11:41:03 p.m. Tony Morelli's body at 11:41:04 p.m. Jimmy Sullivan, Davy Romano, and Nicky Costa were all struck within the next 2 seconds as the train continued forward, despite emergency braking. The train came to complete stop at 11:41:47 p.m., approximately 350 feet past the platform, carrying 5 dead bodies in various states of trauma beneath its undercarriage and wheels. The train operator immediately radioed for emergency response and police. The passengers on the train, approximately 37 people traveling this late on a Thursday night, reported hearing impacts and feeling the train's emergency braking, but had no view of what had happened on the platform. Bumpy Johnson boarded the train at 11:41:01 p.m., entering through the doors that opened automatically when the train reached the platform, taking a seat in a car that contained 3 other passengers who were listening to music or reading, and who hadn't witnessed what had happened on the platform. When transit police arrived at 11:52 p.m. to investigate reports of multiple people on the tracks, they found 5 bodies in various states of severe trauma, all consistent with being struck by a train traveling at speed. They found no witnesses on the platform. Bumpy had been the only person present, and he'd boarded the train and exited at the next station before police arrived. The investigation that followed identified the 5 deceased as Robert Delacroix, Anthony Morelli, James Sullivan, David Romano, and Nicholas Costa, all of whom had criminal records and known associations with organized crime. The medical examiner determined that Delacroix had died from electrocution prior to being struck by the train. His heart had stopped from contact with the third rail. The other 4 had died from blunt force trauma consistent with being hit by a train. The investigation concluded that 5 men had been on the subway tracks when a train arrived, that all 5 had been killed, and that the deaths appeared to be either accidental or possibly suicides given the men's criminal backgrounds and the fact that no witnesses reported seeing them pushed. No charges were filed. No arrests were made. The official position was that 5 criminals had died in a subway accident that would be ruled misadventure pending completion of investigation into whether the men had been intoxicated or were on the tracks deliberately. The unofficial position, the understanding that circulated through New York's criminal networks within 48 hours, was different and more accurate. 5 professional assassins had cornered Bumpy Johnson on a subway platform, had attempted to push him onto the tracks, and had all ended up dead while Bumpy boarded the train and rode home. The Colombo crime family, which had hired the 5 assassins, received the news through intermediaries who'd been monitoring the situation. The family's response was to immediately cancel any further contracts on Bumpy Johnson, and to issue internal orders that no family members were to take actions against him without explicit approval from family leadership. The cost of the failed assassination, $50,000 paid to the 5 assassins plus the loss of 5 experienced contract killers, was less significant than the message the failure sent. Bumpy Johnson couldn't be killed through conventional methods, couldn't be trapped even when outnumbered 5-1 on a subway platform, couldn't be eliminated through professional assassination that would have succeeded against virtually anyone else. The legend of the subway platform became one of more famous stories in Bumpy's collection of near-death survivals. 5 assassins cornered him. A train arrived. Only Bumpy got on. All 5 ended up under the tracks. The mathematics were perfect. The outcome was absolute. And everyone who heard the story understood exactly what it meant. Bumpy Johnson, at 63 years old, remained as dangerous as he'd been at 33, and attempting to kill him in confined spaces with limited escape routes only created opportunities for him to demonstrate exactly why he'd survived 4 decades in one of America's most violent criminal environments.